There's a reason the Cleveland Browns still don't have a head coach, and it's not because they're stuck, confused, or falling behind. It's because their process is unlike anything else in the NFL. While other teams moved fast, made decisions, and locked in their futures, Cleveland slowed everything down. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into silence, and fans started asking the same question over and over again: what is taking so long? The answer is stranger than most people realize. Behind closed doors, the Browns aren't just interviewing coaches. According to reports, they're testing them, evaluating them, breaking them down in ways most NFL candidates have never experienced. Essays, personality tests, homework assignments, not hypotheticals, actual requirements. And the moment that information leaked, everything changed. Because suddenly this wasn't just a coaching search anymore, it was a filter. A system that quietly rewards certain candidates and pushes others away, not with headlines, not with drama, just with time and pressure. Some coaches are willing to jump through those hoops, others aren't, and that's where things get uncomfortable. Reports suggest names have already backed away, not because they weren't interested in Cleveland, but because they didn't want this version of Cleveland, the one that asks for patience, compliance, and alignment before trust is ever given. That's why the Browns' search feels frozen on the surface but active underneath. Because while fans wait for an announcement, the organization is gathering data, stacking profiles, comparing answers, and deciding not just who can coach but who fits their way of thinking. And here's the part nobody can ignore. When a team builds a process this intense, it doesn't just reveal who they hire, it reveals who they won't. So the question isn't whether Cleveland will eventually name a head coach. The real question is what kind of coach survives this process, and what that says about the future of the Browns once the choice is finally made. Because in the NFL, how you choose often matters just as much as who you choose. And Cleveland is telling us everything without saying a word. On the surface, it feels simple. A coach gets fired, a search begins, and a replacement is named shortly after. That's how it usually goes in the NFL, but with the Cleveland Browns, nothing has followed the usual script. When Kevin Stefanski was let go, most people assumed the transition would be quick. Instead, weeks passed, then more silence, and suddenly Cleveland was the only team still waiting while others had already moved on. That delay wasn't just noticeable, it was loud. Reports began circulating that a hire was imminent. Then those timelines quietly came and went. Each missed expectation added another layer of frustration for fans who have seen this movie before, not because they wanted a rushed decision, but because the lack of clarity felt familiar. What makes this even more jarring is how quickly Stefanski himself landed elsewhere. While Cleveland continued evaluating and reevaluating, he was already settled into a new role, collecting a massive paycheck and moving forward. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. It made the Browns look frozen. But the truth is, this delay isn't about indecision, it's about intention. Cleveland isn't dragging its feet because it doesn't know what it wants. It's dragging its feet because it wants everything, every data point, every behavioral profile, every possible indicator that the next hire won't fail the way previous ones did. And that mindset explains the timeline. Instead of moving fast, the Browns slowed the process down to a crawl. Multiple interview rounds, additional requirements, waiting on candidates still in playoff runs, even pausing to ensure procedural boxes are checked before advancing anything officially. To Cleveland, patience equals protection. But to the outside world, it looks like hesitation. And that gap between intention and perception is where frustration grows, because in the NFL, time doesn't just pass, it costs leverage. Other teams move, candidates adjust, options quietly disappear. So while the Browns believe they're being careful, many fans believe they're being left behind. That tension is what defines this moment. Cleveland isn't stuck, they're not lost. They're deliberately moving slower than everyone else, betting that precision will beat speed this time. The question is whether that bet pays off, or whether this delay becomes the first sign that the same old problems are about to repeat themselves again. This is where the Browns' search stops looking slow and starts looking strange. Because once details about the process began leaking out, it became clear Cleveland isn't doing what anyone else in the league is doing. According to multiple reports, the Cleveland Browns aren't just interviewing head coach candidates, they're evaluating them on an entirely different level. We're talking about written essays, personality tests, homework assignments that stretch across multiple rounds of interviews, not casual conversations or football chalk talk, but structured tasks designed to measure how a candidate thinks, reacts, and aligns with the organization's philosophy. By NFL standards, that's unheard of. Most teams want to know how a coach leads a locker room, builds staff, and calls games under pressure. Cleveland wants that too, but they also want data. A lot of it. Reports describe the Browns as a deeply data-driven operation, one that believes decision-making shouldn't rely on instincts alone. On paper, that sounds smart. The idea is simple: gather as much information as possible so nothing is left to chance. But in reality, that approach changes the entire dynamic of the search. Because now, candidates aren't just being interviewed, they're being tested. And not everyone is comfortable with that. It's been said that some candidates see this process as excessive, not because they fear scrutiny, but because of the time, energy, and compliance it demands. Coaches are traveling, interviewing with multiple teams, relocating families, and managing playoff responsibilities, all while being asked to sit down and write multi-part essays. That's where the process starts acting like a filter. Younger coaches, or those still trying to break through, may see this as an opportunity, a chance to prove intelligence, preparation, and alignment. But for veteran coaches with leverage, this kind of structure can feel unnecessary. And according to reports, that tension may already be having an effect. Names have quietly stepped back, timelines have stretched, Cleveland has found itself waiting while others move on. What makes this even more interesting is that this approach isn't new. League insiders have said the Browns have run versions of this process before. It's part of their identity, shaped by years of analytics-driven thinking. The question now is whether this process is smart or flawed. It's whether it fits the moment Cleveland is in. Because when the process becomes the story, it stops being invisible. And once that happens, it doesn't just shape who you hire, it shapes who's willing to raise their hand in the first place. And that may be the most important consequence of all. At first, the Browns' coaching search looked crowded, plenty of interest, plenty of names, but quietly that list has started to thin out, and not because Cleveland made cuts. According to league chatter and reporting, some candidates have chosen to step away on their own. Not publicly, not with dramatic statements, just quiet exits. And when you look at the situation closely, the reasons start to make sense. This isn't about fear of pressure. NFL head coaches live in pressure. It's about the cost of this process. The time, the commitment, the uncertainty. Coaching candidates aren't just sitting in interviews, they're flying across the country, juggling multiple opportunities, managing families, and preparing for next seasons that are already approaching fast. Now add Cleveland's requirements on top of that. Multiple interview rounds, written essays, personality testing, homework assignments that stretch between stages of the search. According to reports, this isn't a one-day evaluation, it's an ongoing process that demands focus and buy-in before a job is even close to guaranteed. For some coaches, that's fine. But for others, especially established names with options, it changes the math. If you're a veteran coach who's already proven yourself, you don't need to spend weeks jumping through hoops to validate your philosophy. When other teams offer clearer timelines and simpler structures, walking away quietly becomes the rational choice. And that's where the filtering begins. The Cleveland Browns aren't necessarily pushing candidates out, but their process naturally favors a certain type of coach, one who's early in his career, deeply analytical, and willing to invest heavily upfront without guarantees. Reports suggest that's exactly why some names have faded from the conversation. Not because Cleveland didn't like them, but because the candidates decided the environment wasn't worth the wait. There's also the human side of it. Coaches have families, kids in school, homes being packed up while interviews happen. When the process stretches longer than expected, that uncertainty becomes exhausting. And at some point, stability matters more than opportunity. That's why this search feels quieter than it should. Because what's happening isn't chaos, it's attrition. Cleveland is learning in real time who's willing to endure the process and who prefers clarity over complexity. And that matters because every candidate who steps away reshapes the final outcome, even if fans never hear their names. So when people ask why this search feels stalled, the answer isn't simple. It's not that the Browns can't choose. It's that the process itself is choosing for them. And that reality sets the stage for who's still standing and why. At this point in the search, the conversation has narrowed, and two names keep circling back to the center. On one side, there's Grant Udinski, on the other, Nate Scheelhaase. And while both are viewed as smart, modern thinkers, the way Cleveland is handling each candidate tells its own story. Udinski has been the name generating the most visible buzz. Reports suggest he's impressed in interviews, and his background as an NFL offensive coordinator gives him a level of credibility that jumps off the page. He's young, aggressive in philosophy, and already trusted to run an offense at the highest level. For a team looking to modernize, that matters. But here, where things get interesting. Despite all that momentum, the Cleveland Browns haven't rushed to close the deal. Instead, they've been willing to wait specifically for Scheelhaase. And in the NFL, waiting is rarely accidental. Scheelhaase doesn't have the same public hype, but his resume checks different boxes. He comes from the Los Angeles Rams ecosystem and has worked under Sean McVay, one of the most respected offensive minds in football. That alone carries weight in league circles. What really stands out, though, is timing. Cleveland reportedly delayed parts of the process to accommodate Scheelhaase's availability, even with playoff games in the way. That sends a signal. Teams don't wait weeks for candidates they're only mildly interested in. They wait when they believe someone might be the guy. This creates an interesting contrast. Udinski represents immediacy. He's available. He's already proven at the NFL coordinator level. He fits the data-driven mold Cleveland values. Scheelhaase represents patience, projection, long-term belief in development over resume. Neither option is clearly right or wrong, but they suggest different priorities. Choosing Udinski would signal a desire to move forward now, leaning on proven NFL experience and offensive authority. Choosing Scheelhaase would signal belief in coaching lineage, adaptability, and upside, even if it requires waiting longer and taking on more uncertainty. And that's the tension defining this moment. Cleveland isn't just deciding between two coaches, they're deciding between two timelines, two philosophies of risk, two versions of what smart looks like in today's NFL. The fact that this decision is still open tells us everything. Because when a team keeps waiting, it's not because they're unsure. It's because they're weighing which future they're willing to live with once the choice is final. Whether Cleveland wants it to be the focus or not, there's a presence hanging over this entire search that keeps coming up: analytics. For years now, the Cleveland Browns have been known as one of the most data-driven organizations in the league. That identity didn't form overnight. It was built intentionally, piece by piece, with the belief that smarter decisions come from deeper information. At the center of that philosophy is Paul DePodesta, who helped construct one of the most robust analytics departments in the NFL. His influence isn't about play calling or locker room speeches, it's about process, evaluation, risk management, and eliminating guesswork wherever possible. On paper, that's not a bad thing. Analytics have reshaped football in real ways. They've improved roster construction, fourth down decisions, and long-term planning. Cleveland isn't wrong for leaning into that edge, but where things get complicated is when data stops being a tool and starts becoming a gatekeeper. Because in Cleveland, analytics don't just support decisions, they help define them. That's why the interview process looks the way it does. Personality testing, written responses, homework assignments, these aren't random hoops, they're data points, inputs meant to project how a coach will think, adapt, and collaborate inside a system that values structure and alignment. And this is where the shadow forms. Some around the league believe this environment favors a very specific type of coach, someone comfortable with scrutiny, someone who welcomes collaboration, someone who doesn't bristle at oversight or layered decision-making. That doesn't mean the Browns don't value leadership, it means they value leadership that fits within a broader framework. But frameworks can cut both ways. When analytics have a strong voice, they can stabilize an organization, but they can also slow it down. Every decision gets weighed, every instinct gets tested, and in a league that often rewards decisiveness, that balance becomes delicate. This is why some candidates reportedly hesitate. Not because they hate data, but because they wonder how much autonomy actually exists once the job begins. How much freedom a head coach has to trust feel over formula when the game tightens up and the models don't have answers. And that concern isn't loud, it's quiet. It shows up in delayed interviews, in candidates choosing other paths, in Cleveland waiting longer than expected while others move forward. This doesn't mean analytics are the problem. It means culture matters. And right now, Cleveland's culture is being evaluated just as much as the candidates themselves. Because every coach understands one thing very clearly. When data speaks loudly, it shapes everything from how you're hired to how you're allowed to lead. That's the shadow hovering over this search. Not dysfunction, not chaos, but a question of balance and whether Cleveland has finally found the right mix between information and instinct, or is still searching for it. There's a fine line between being careful and being paralyzed, and right now, that line is exactly where the Cleveland Browns are standing. On the surface, their approach looks smart. Gather more data, ask more questions, add more layers so nothing slips through the cracks. It's the kind of thinking that feels responsible, especially for an organization that's been burned before. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the desire to eliminate risk becomes the risk. The NFL doesn't reward perfection, it rewards conviction. Coaches don't win games because every decision was optimized in advance. They win because, in the moment, someone trusted their instincts and didn't hesitate. That's where overthinking starts to hurt. When a hiring process becomes this complex, it doesn't just evaluate candidates. It reshapes behavior. Coaches start answering how they think the organization wants them to answer. Creativity gets filtered, personality gets muted, and instead of discovering who someone really is, you end up rewarding who fits the process best. That's dangerous. Because the best coaches aren't always the cleanest fits on paper. They're decisive, opinionated, sometimes uncomfortable. They challenge structures instead of blending into them, and those types of leaders don't always survive multi-layered evaluation systems built around consensus and compliance. History shows this pattern clearly. Organizations that over-engineer decisions often land in the same place, not with disastrous failure but with mediocrity. Teams that are fine, competitive enough to justify patience, stable enough to avoid panic, but never bold enough to break through. That's the real risk Cleveland faces. Not choosing the wrong coach, but choosing the safest one. The one who checks every box, aligns with every department, says the right things in every room, and then, once the season starts, blends into the background while bigger moments demand sharper edges. Overthinking doesn't fail loudly, it fails quietly. It shows up in stalled drives, in conservative decisions when aggression is needed, in seasons that feel close but never close enough, and by the time it's obvious, the window has already narrowed. Cleveland has the opportunity to break that cycle. But doing so requires something their process doesn't naturally encourage: trust in judgment, trust in instinct, trust that not every variable can be controlled before the choice is made. Because in a league built on speed and confidence, hesitation doesn't just slow you down. It defines you. And right now, the Browns aren't just deciding who to hire. They're deciding whether they believe football decisions are meant to be solved or made. That answer will matter long after this search is over. By the time this search finally ends, the answer won't just be a name. It'll be a statement. Because the Cleveland Browns aren't just choosing a head coach, they're revealing who they believe they are right now, and maybe more importantly, who they're willing to become. Around the league, there's a phrase that keeps coming up whenever Cleveland is mentioned. It's not shouted, it's not said with anger, it's said quietly, almost matter of fact. The Browns are the Browns. To some, that means complicated processes. To others, it means caution layered on top of caution. A team that wants to be smarter than everyone else but sometimes forgets that football isn't solved, it's lived. That phrase isn't meant as an insult, it's a summary. Because every organization has an identity. Some are aggressive, some are bold, some are chaotic. Cleveland's identity has become methodical, data-heavy, and slow to trust, even when the moment demands belief. And this hire will either reinforce that or finally challenge it. If the Browns choose safety, structure, and total alignment, the message is clear. Control matters more than conviction. Minimizing risk matters more than embracing upside. And that approach may bring stability, but stability isn't the same as progress. But if Cleveland leans into belief in a coach, belief in a direction, belief that not everything needs to be pre-approved, then this moment becomes something else entirely. Not a reset, not another cycle, but a pivot. That's why this decision feels heavier than usual. Fans aren't demanding perfection, they're demanding clarity. They want to know what the Browns stand for when the margins are thin and the choices are uncomfortable. Because confusion is what hurts most, not losing. And the irony is this: the Browns' process is designed to eliminate uncertainty, but right now it's creating more of it. Players are watching, coaches are watching, the league is watching. And when this finally ends, nobody will remember how many essays were written or how many interviews were conducted. They'll remember the result and whether it felt inevitable or familiar. So when the announcement comes, listen closely, not to the press release, not to the buzzwords. Listen to what it tells you about trust, about confidence, about risk. Because once again, the Browns are at a crossroads they've seen before. And whether this time is different won't be decided by what they say next, but by what they choose to believe in when it finally matters. That's why people keep saying it. The Browns are the Browns. The only question left is whether they still have to be.